Well, to help us try and make sense of this changing landscape, Dr. Scott Birchall, the Senior Lecturer in International Relations at Deakin University, joins us. Scott, thank you very much. Nice to see you as always. So just looking at that story now, this one of these gunmen who took 4 hostages at that Jewish supermarket, he's claiming to have links to IS, but also linking himself to the 2 men who started the attack, who seem to be Al-Qaeda related, Yemeni trained. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think it's a disaggregated threat. These are often cells of groups of men particularly, but in some cases women, who operate quite independently of each other. Some have received training. It appears, for example, that the 2 who targeted Charlie Hebdo went through Yemen in about 2011. We're not sure why there's been such a gap between then and actually acting the last week. But in the other case, of course, this Twitter claim is that he was inspired by the efforts to. Well, there's a lot of different motives, but some are inspired by Al-Qaeda, some are inspired by ISIS, some are inspired by a reaction to a whole lot of other issues. And the danger, I think, is that we conflate them all as one single unified threat.
Group,
when in fact they're motivated by a series of very different issues, and whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Iraq or Syria, we've got to actually disaggregate them and see them as quite a complex but separate group of threats.
Now, the relationship between the Kouachi brothers and Anwar al-Awlaki, who was actually killed in a drone attack several years ago, that would be worrying to anyone that's thought that that person's influence on terror might have died with him.
Yes, his influence is carried on on YouTube and in recorded tapes. So even though, as you say, he was killed by a drone in 2011, his influence is still quite widespread. You can get his video recordings on YouTube quite easily. There's some more moderate speeches given early on, sort of 2009, 2008, but the more militant ones, encouraging people to take action against those who, for example, printed those cartoons of the Prophet, can also be found without too much difficulty via a quick Google search. So even though he physically isn't around and he's not there to inspire people personally, his influence is sustained by his digital footprint.
So that is what brings us to today's issues, where you've got these splinter groups, as that commentator described it, as sort of almost laissez-faire. How then do world leaders who we have seen unite in an extraordinary way in Paris overnight, how do they tackle this issue?
Well, I have to say, I mean, it's nice to have solidarity with the victims of these shootings, but there's some journalists in Turkey and in perhaps other countries who are going to be rather amused by the commitment to freedom of the press that they're demonstrating, seeing in their leaders demonstrate at this particular march this morning or overnight. So, look, you've got to obviously try and de-radicalise these threats by, I think the best way is to try and neutralise the appeal that some of these firebrand preachers and some of the other organisations have to those disaffected youth. The common themes seem to be young men disaffected and alienated from their own societies, looking for some meaning in their lives, travelling to countries and receiving training in both militancy but also theological inspiration as well, and then going back and perhaps acting on this, or in the case of ISIS, joining the organisation and fighting Western troops in Iraq itself. So there's no one solution. You've got to have a number of different strategies. But the only thing that will work in the long term is to dilute the appeal that these militant organisations actually have to people that they need to recruit to keep these causes going, really.
And Scott, in Nigeria over the weekend, there was that blast that killed 19 people, reportedly because a bomb was strapped to a 10-year-old girl. We're just hearing the latest out of Nigeria is that there were twin blasts last night involving maybe a 15-year-old girl who was blown up at a crowded market. 4 people have died there. What's happening in Nigeria as they head towards elections, and it seems to be every day it's people are being killed there.
Well, it's terrible. I mean, Boko Haram is a militant Islamist organisation which is a bit like ISIS in the sense it's now controlling significant amounts of territory, particularly in the northeast of Nigeria. Nigeria is a very wealthy country by African standards, one of the largest economy in Africa, and therefore a very prized resource for groups like that. And what we're seeing, of course, is that while the attention of the world is on Paris recently, there's been some terrible atrocities committed in Nigeria by Boko Haram, where we saw only a few days ago reports of up to 2,000 people being killed as one of the towns was overrun by Boko Haram militants. And the President Goodluck Jonathan, who faces, I think, a presidential election in about 5 weeks' time, has been strangely reluctant to confront or admit the difficulty of confronting the threat. And it appears that his troops are not particularly well motivated or trained. They're in some cases no match for Boko Haram, as we know have been kidnapping as well as killing people. The famous case of the schoolgirls who are
still missing.
Are still missing. Now using suicide bombers, 10-year-old girls that's been reported in recent times. So whilst we're focusing on Europe and perhaps Western threats, the descent of Nigeria has been a tragic case, because I can remember not long ago Nigeria being put up as an example of a country which deserved maybe a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. It was seen as a strong and successful performer in Africa. Now it's a country that is riven by this insurgency, and the government doesn't seem to have the resources or perhaps the commitment at this stage to either admit the scale of the threat and danger or to actually confront it and do something about it.
And you've got Al-Shabaab as well. Are there any formal links between Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and Yemen? I mean, in terms of this kind of, again, I know you're saying let's not try and make it a sort of a homogenous situation.
It's tempting to sort of see them as like an octopus, where they're all linked in together and there's a central brain which coordinates these attacks. But in fact, they learn from each other, and the success of these attacks is that they are autonomous cells, meaning that the fewer people who are aware of these attacks coming, the more likely that they can be carried out with success. So even though they don't have direct relations with each other, and even if they did, that wouldn't really change the situation much. They do get inspiration. Sometimes they might get some money. They might get training. But whether it's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda and some of the other groups fighting the Syrian government at the moment, they all have slightly different agendas, and it's very difficult to have a one-stop solution to deal with.
Yeah, it's harder to deal with it. Is that more worrying as we sit in Australia and try to deal with youths who might want to head overseas and come back? Was the Kouachi brothers being so well trained and so well able to handle their guns the game changer that some people said it was last week?
Well, the strange thing is that they were on the watch list. I think both the Americans and the French had them on a watch list, so they weren't completely unknown to intelligence authorities. So when you hear, as we will in the next week or two, calls for more power and more authority to the police and intelligence services, the first question I think we have to ask is, if we knew that these people were a worry, we knew they'd been through Yemen, we knew they'd had some perhaps militant training, what is it that you haven't got that you need now to actually clamp down on these groups? And perhaps it's just the overwhelming number that they're unable to deal with in a coherent way. Yeah.
Scott, thanks as always for your insights.
Thanks.